Thank you very much for coming on a wet Sunday afternoon, but I think this is going to be an important meeting for those of us who are here. And we've got three excellent speakers. I think when we started to plan for this meeting, which is the Free Mumia Jamal campaign, you see our banner up there, we didn't know that China was going to be quite so prominent in the news, but we did know it was an important subject that we should be looking at as anti-imperialists. So to start with, I'm going to pass the microphone to my comrade Wilf, who'll just give us some introductory remarks.
Good afternoon. Before we start the speech of the discussion, I've been asked to say a few words on why the Mumia Campaign is holding this meeting. Well, it stems from the meeting, the Free Mumia Campaign held in Brixton on I think, July the 17th, in recognition of comrade and brother Tom Coward's particular support and solidarity with Socialist China, and where Keith Bennett of Friends of Socialist China gave a talk on China and its support for the world's people's struggle against imperialism. At this meeting, among the questions and contributions, Comrade Kumar drew attention to an article in the monthly review article by Cheng En-fu and Yang Zheng on China's triple revolution theory, and called upon people to study it. Now, not everyone will have read this article, but it is an excellent article that shows a very clear perspective on building socialism in China, learning lessons in China's responsibilities in the international struggle against imperialism, particularly the hegemonistic ambitions of the United States. I don't need to emphasize this too strongly, because the last 2 years of the progress of the Zionist genocide in Gaza, aided by the United States and Europe's complicity and arms sales, has clearly revealed it. We are at a time, despite the noise, the lies and propaganda of the imperialist bribed news media in the West, of a great shift in global power, and the United States and its ability to dictate to the world is in decline, politically and economically. This makes our internationalism important in guiding our anti-imperialist work in supporting Mumia and all political prisoners. The international situation at this time is affecting everything we do, from Gaza in the Middle East to the constant threat from imperialism that will launch new global adventures. Recent news about alleged spying are part of a constant stream of anti-China propaganda to prepare public opinion to support an aggressive stance and justify a new Cold War and arms building. China's strength and the growing confidence of the countries of the global south to come together in moves to break away from the dictatorship of the United States is something which must be applauded by all genuine anti-imperialist movements, and is a source of some optimism. Indeed, this optimism is always expressed in many of Mumia's talks on prison radio. So that's all I wanted to say to set the tone of the meeting, I hope. But now I pass back to Chairperson.
Okay. We've got three speakers. There'll be about half an hour each, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion, and we'll break and have some informal conversation as well, I hope, because it's going to be a lot of stimulating ideas. So the first person to address the meeting this afternoon is Cecil Gutzmore, and he's the chair of the Free Mumia Jamal campaign. And I'll let him introduce his topic as we switch chairs here.
Sorry, this one.
Yep. Right. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Comrade Wilf. And thank you, comrades, for being with us. What do you say? Sit down?
Yes.
All right.
It's all about you.
That's all about. Got to take instructions. She's under my way. Okay. What I'm wanting to do, not a lot. I'm not a theorist on China. I approach world affairs, including China, on the basis of a political position that some people, including me, call revolutionary Pan-Africanism. And what it effectively means is that we take historical materialism absolutely seriously, Marxism absolutely seriously, and we take our racial specificity equally seriously, and we approach the world in that double, if you like, perspective, that combined perspective. And I'm not putting myself up there with them, but if you wanted to think of people who, broadly speaking, occupy that position, you'd have Walter Rodney, you'd have Kwame Nkrumah, and you'd have Claudio Jones, people like that, who are very serious about race and very serious about class, and the two things matter to be kept together and to be understood systematically as connected. Why exactly is that so? We've lived, I'm wanting to say that the current ramp against China is a piece of Western racism. It's more than that, but that it certainly is. And that arises from the fact that you can think of the world as fundamentally controlled by something called capitalism imperialism. And Stuart Hall said that it's structured in racism, and he was right to say that. But that system has some strictly ideological characteristics. Among them, it seems to me, it's racism, it's drive for world domination. That's obviously economic, but it's also ideological. And I think that's worth thinking of that system as what I call Judeo-Christendom. And the relevance of that seems to me very evident in what the world has experienced, with the Palestinian bearing the brunt of it for the last 2 years, which is a massacre of unimaginable proportion, excused, justified, supplied by the allegedly civilized Christian West. And there's no evidence of civilization there, very little evidence of Christianity. Of course, your assessment of Christianity is up for assessment, but we'll leave that to one side. So that's what we're in the presence of. And this is a system which has established its dominance over the whole of the world over, let us say, the last 4 or 5 or 6 centuries, certainly since the 1400s. During that period, it has encountered, because it's being structured in racism is actually to do with the fact that it's run by white folk. And they have gone abroad, as it were, and there's a good joke about discovering beautiful people and killing them. And that's essentially what has happened. So they have discovered people who don't look like them, people who look like me, so Africans. They discovered Native Americans, and they've discovered Asian, people who look like Chinese or Japanese, if you like, and Indians. And the record of slaughter is outrageous, is monumental, is absolutely undeniable, and it's what we are now faced Comrade Wilf correctly mentioned that the world is changing. And one of the ways in which the world has changed is that territories that were previously colonized are no longer colonized, and a struggle against colonialism is what resulted in the state of affairs of 100+ independent states around the world. Many of those peoples and states didn't see themselves as fighting against imperialism. They saw themselves fighting against colonialism. And it is fundamentally important that the victory against colonialism is a very incomplete victory if the system of imperialism remains in place. And our best example of that is what happened in Haiti. Everybody knows that between 1791 and 1804 or 1800, the Haitians defeated a French army twice, defeated a massive British army. It helped that the British can't, and white generally couldn't handle tropical diseases in those days. So a big part of the explanation of that defeat. And they also defeated the French. Sorry, the Spaniards. But imperialism was still in place. You can defeat armies, big armies even, and very little in respect of the system changes. And so powerful, all powerful still was that system, so that in 1824, they effectively forced the Haitian government, I think it was a mistake on the part of the Haitian government, to agree to compensate the slave owners for the loss of their human property, allegedly, and the loss of their real property. So that only happened because of the power of imperialism. It mattered that Haiti had to be transformed in what, in my view, is the first neo-colony, because a class internally had to be put into place which exploited those at the bottom with a view to themselves benefiting in a small way, and their masters abroad receiving the benefits and so on. We know the story. So neocolonialism has been in place ever since the 1820s, and it had been developing a dramatic leap forward in that system and that way of running the world in the past 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. Now, one of the ways in which the world has changed, the key way in which the world has changed, is the Chinese Revolution. Everybody should know that that revolution started sometime shortly after the First World War, certainly in the 1920s, that a very small and indeed on top of that decimated industrial proletariat was brought into struggle with one of the world's largest peasantries. And in the Communist Party of China and the People's Revolutionary Army, that combination threw out imperialism and all its works from China. They captured all of the resources and almost all of the territory. And the existing bits that remained of imperialism, Formosa and Taiwan and so on, we see the trouble that that is in fact causing. So to liberate that massive proportion of humanity was a gigantic blow against imperialism. It's a gigantic blow in the interest of the wretched of the earth, as we know that famous phrase. And during that revolutionary process, because it lasted, as I said, from the 1920s to 1949, when the Chinese Revolution, what people think of as the Chinese Revolution, occurred. But over the previous few decades, the Chinese progressive forces were engaged in a war which included a war against Japanese imperialism. And the Chinese lost in that war perhaps 30 million, so an unimaginable number, but it's actually how many that they lost. The struggle continued, and as I say, there was the triumph of the late 1940s. Now, everybody knows that if you compare what the Chinese Revolution has done for the Chinese people with what industrial capitalism is doing for the Western people, you see the concentration of wealth, incredible concentration. You see immiseration of the masses. You see ideological approaches and structures that, to borrow a phrase from Hillary Clinton, and her actually little speech in 2016 is actually worth reading, because what she's talking about is, when she talks about the creation of deplorables, in what successful capitalist ideology combined with racism and nationalism has done to a significant part of the proletariat that Marx in 1948 thought represented the grave diggers of Western capitalism, and they have done remarkably little grave digging ever since. And it matters that only in Russia did the proletariat liberate itself. We leave aside the complications of what happened as Nazism was rolled back in the middle of the 1940s and the revolutions of Eastern Europe. Importantly, that independent revolution of the Chinese mattered. It transformed something like a quarter of humanity into human beings with everything operating in their favor in a world where there are enemies. And the ruthlessness and idiocy of the enemy is visible in the fact that the United Nations, which had a seat on the Security Council, does still have a seat on the Security Council for China, that for decades, that seat was occupied not by China, but by the rump of the Chinese state. And the West, which knows, because it said for decades that Formosa and Taiwan are China, how they can now be seriously saying that those territories are not China, and that China is being aggressive in the move to unite its territory, which it has an absolute right to do. Now, we live, us revolutionary Pan-Africanists know that we live in a complicated world. So China, with its power and organization, can and does act towards other peoples in other parts of the world that might raise questions. I don't know if you watch television, but I'm seeing, is it Angola, where at the moment there's a kind of a ramp against Chinese in the African country of Angola. And I come from a place called Jamaica. And during my childhood, one or two things happened. One of the things that happened is that I was conscious enough to see the economy of the little town I came from being transformed by Chinese taking control of the distribution part of the economy. And that town had been transformed in one which, in the post-emancipation period, Black people and mixed race Black people had come to make an economy. And in my childhood, I saw that economy being transformed. the British helped Syrians in their economic entry into the place. They didn't give Chinese any help, but the Chinese were organized enough to do what they did. So if it is the case that China is now powerful, and if it's also the case that most of the states that were once colonies are now neo-colonies, they are being run by politically backward incompetence. And if you are in a place that's run by politically backward incompetence, both Western imperialism and Chinese non-imperialism, because I don't regard China as imperialist, we'll have a discussion about that in due course, but powerful Chinese coming with resources, when they face idiotic, backward, neo-colonial leaders, they make exactly the same kind of deals with them that the capitalist imperialists do. And it matters that to a substantial extent, not because of the wickedness of the Chinese, but because of the incompetence and backwardness of our leadership, things are happening right now that shouldn't happen. Let me give you a little example. I come from Jamaica. And the Chinese government is providing road and other infrastructure. You pay for road infrastructure via, what are those tolls called? That's how those roads are, right? But our ruling circle in Jamaica has managed to give the Chinese, in addition to the tolls from the roads, which is how toll roads get paid for, to give them a whole heap of land as an additional way of paying for the infrastructure that the Chinese government and Chinese government-related companies are inputting in that place. So things can go wrong that are not the fault of China, but the fault of people who haven't bothered to read Rodney and don't know that and don't know that something called investment, direct capitalist investment, doesn't really particularly matter where it comes from, is simply a way of transferring resources owned in the case of Jamaica, owned by the Jamaican people, into hands of other people. And what Rodney helped us to understand is the extent to which in that transfer of alleged capital, nothing comes by way of capital, because the transaction involves making the locals pay for the development, for the investment. Whole heap of processes are put into place. And if you go and look, there's a perfect case with Guyana right now. The oil is being extracted at the expense of the Guyanese people. They're simply converting some of the income into the capital allegedly used for developing the. All right. So we're talking about China. Us Pan-Africanists, revolutionary Pan-Africanists, know the importance of the Chinese Revolution, know that the enemy is still there, know the ruthlessness and wickedness, murderous nature of the enemy that the Chinese face. I personally believe, and this repetition, that the ramp that we're presently witnessing, including in a world where the West is saying that nobody's entitled to nuclear weapons, and we've just seen them bomb Iran. Anybody who looked up that story understands how it came about, knows the way in which they captured the West, that is, captured the International Atomic Energy Agency, put a motion through that. That became a motion that went to the Security Council. China and Russia got their eyes off the ball, and that perfectly illegitimate motion became a Security Council motion, which could be used against Iran as a UN resolution, side by side what the Americans and Europeans were doing. Now, China, important. Important for the oppressed of the earth. A revolution that was an important blow against imperialism on behalf of the oppressed of the earth. And there is no fundamental contradiction of that, in my view. Not that China, leave aside the things I'm going on about, including misleading our exploitable neo-colonial ruling circle. There are things that I don't think China should have done. I don't think under Mao, China should have invaded India. I don't think China should have invaded Vietnam. I think that what the revolutionary China did in Tibet is deeply, deeply questionable, and so on. So we're not talking about the perfect revolution. We're not talking about perfect people. But we're talking about an event that is epoch-making in world history, and we need to support the Chinese Revolution against the enemy that is now seeking to consolidate its control of the world economy, which using all kinds of wicked mechanisms they have put into place over the last 500 years. So let's jump to India. It matters that we get told that Lancashire cotton outsold Indian cotton, and it was nothing to do with the efficiency of Lancashire. It was to do with the fact that the British authorities had control of India and were able to use taxation there and here to do down Indian cotton production. It matters that we're talking about people who sent an embassy to China in the late 1700s and were sent away by the then Chinese ruler, being told that you have absolutely nothing that we need and you can just go away again as far as we're concerned. So that was the following century. The same people who sent an embassy were producing opium in India and forcing it on the Chinese. And the Chinese were trying to fight off imposed sales of opium in their country for 2 opium wars. That's what that was about. Them resisting the West's attempt to make money out of forcing opium on the people. And if you think it's so far-fetched, we saw the same thing happen 3 decades ago, maybe 4, in the 70s, when Reagan and them used illegal substances to pay for the overthrow of the Sandinista revolution. That is how the Contras were funded, out of selling drugs into the black and other parts of the United States population. So they have not changed. And to go back to something that I was saying, it matters that when we look at the world, we see that people who are saying no nuclear proliferation as part of the drive against China have just agreed to give Australia nuclear submarines, right? That's nuclear proliferation, and it's happening. And right? So we need to know the ruthlessness of the enemy. And when they send somebody who looks benevolent, like what's her name, the American representative who they sent to Taiwan and Formosa the other day.
Pelosi?
Huh?
Nancy Pelosi?
Yes, exactly. These people look benevolent, right? But the truth of the matter is that there's nothing benevolent about them, and they put them up in order to deceive and so on. So I know that 2 presentations are coming that will be much more theoretical than mine, but those are the remarks that I wish to offer in terms of the complex and difficult world in which we revolutionary Africans live. We know that China is important. We know that the Chinese Revolution is irreversible. We know that what is happening against China now, led by the West, is wicked racism. We know that big mistakes have been made in our place by us having a revolution that was not a revolution against imperialism, but a revolution against colonialism. And we're paying the price of that. And whether we will be able to liberate ourselves effectively against imperialism is a challenge that revolutionary Pan-Africanism faces at the moment. We're not like China. We're not like India. Both of those countries had histories of national unification, mythical or real. And Indians and Chinese can reach back and did reach back to that in a way that Africans can't. So African unity is a difficult thing to struggle for. And we talk romantically about the cultural element of it. But the truth of the matter is that at the state level, there never was a unified Africa. And making a unified Africa in the circumstances in which we now find ourselves is a difficult task. We have a lot to learn from the Chinese. We must preserve our relationship with the Chinese people and Chinese government and Chinese revolution. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecil. And the next speaker is Higginbottom, and you can I'll also ask Andy to introduce his subject matters.
Okay, I'm just aligning things up, so I'm speaking to the mic and into this computer here. Okay. Well, first of all, a big thanks for inviting me. I mean, I really appreciate the solidarity with Mumia, and I want to give my solidarity to him. And I also very broadly and fully agree with Cecil's comments and framing, which as I say, I broadly agree with. The title of my talk, which you can see on the screen, is actually a book chapter I wrote about 5 years ago. But what I'm going to do today is take things a bit further, because of course things have moved on further, and the extension of it is very much work in progress. And I should fully admit to my limitations. I mean, I don't speak or read Chinese. I've not been to China. So what do I know? What I know is a little bit about the Marxist-Leninist tradition, and I have studied the history of China, and I do have some slightly secondhand, but I think politically quite real contact with movements in different parts of the world, which we'll come on to. But I really do want to stress the limitations. And so what I'm going to say could be quite schematic, okay? And it is very much in the spirit of discussion and debate. I mean, I think the broad issues are pretty clear, even for quite bourgeois commentary. You have this incredible contrast, which is becoming like a dominant theme of the whole of the 21st century, which is the military power of the United States versus the economic power of China, and to what degree the US is going to use its military power to curb China's growing economic leverage, I would say, over the United States. Now, in terms of how I approach this, I was mentioning to some comrades, there is a methodology which I think is just wrong about how to look at this, which is to think about it in terms of two different logics. One is like competing states and competing capitals. And I say that because in the Anglo-sphere, David Harvey is probably the most influential academic Marxist. This is his theoretical approach. And it's also echoed by Alex Kalinikos, who is the theoretical guru of the Socialist Workers' Party here in the UK. Right? And in this theoretical approach, which I think is essentially not Marxist at all, I think it's Weberian, you have states and you have capitals, and their competitions intersect, and where they intersect, you find a concrete analysis, right? I'm looking for a different approach to how to understand this, which is much more unitary. And so, although what I wrote before was really based on the military side, I do want to develop how does the military connect with the economic, and in particular, what are the contradictions in the social, very Marxist, this social relations of production and circulation. And I think the model for how the economic and the military, probably to this day, certainly if you think of the world system, the model for how to go about this is with Lenin, because what Lenin did is he managed to show, or his time for his political purpose, how the social contradictions at the economic level were transmuted into state contradictions and war between the imperialist states. So in other words, they're not separate logics, right? They're different aspects of the same logic. So this is a bit of an academic point, but I just want to situate what I'm saying. This other point is also slightly academic, but it's actually more internal, right? I think what Cecil gave us is a very fair and broad foundation as anti-imperialists, right? I want to go a bit more directly into the internal discussion as Marxist about what is the Marxist-Leninist tradition and how do we evaluate the situation in China versus the US in that tradition. And a friend of mine sent me this publication recently, which I found very topical and very interesting. And this same point was made by Wang Fei at SOAS just 3 weeks ago at a conference we were at, right? And it's an approving quote from Lenin speaking about the new economic policy. Now, the new economic policy was an opening to markets in 1921 in order to relieve the situation where peasants were not supplying food to the cities, to the industrial working class in the cities, because the peasants were hiding the food. And up to that point, the Bolshevik armies had actually been sequestering the food, they'd actually been taking it, seizing it, using force to take it in a situation of a civil war. So the movement from to the new economic policy to market relations was from a situation of civil war, which is quite important what I'm going to say. So what this writer Li Tuo looks at is how Lenin says, look, we cannot have a direct transition from capitalism to socialism. We're going to have to go on detours. We're going to have to go on zigzags and so on, right? And I fully accept that as a broad position. I don't accept what he draws from it. And this is where the discussion is, right? Now, this is also quoted by Lee. Lenin writes on cooperation. This is very interesting, given the political resonance with the political experience in China. I slightly misordered these two. If the whole of the peasantry had been organized in cooperatives, he writes in this thing in 1923, we would by now have been standing with both feet on the soil of socialism. He's contrasting that with their real situation. They weren't organized in cooperatives. They were in a war, civil war situation, right? And then the on cooperation by Lenin continues, in our country, the political and social revolution preceded the cultural revolution, that very cultural revolution which nevertheless now confronts us, right? And this is really important in terms of what this means for China, because in actual fact, China did achieve a political and social revolution, and then it also achieved a social revolution, and in practice, it had established cooperatives, especially in the countryside, which is what Lenin said they lacked when they introduced the new economic policy. So Lee makes this comparison, which I'm contesting, in terms of the more specific justification for what happens in China. He says, connecting the reform process that began in the 1980s, so that is under Deng Xiaoping, to the experimental nature of the socialist movement, replete with successes and failures, provides a more complex perspective for analysis regarding the relationship between the reforms in 1980s and Lenin's new economic policy, China is clearly the inheritor of Lenin's thought. What he's doing is he's claiming Lenin for Deng Xiaoping, privatization reforms. That's what's happening here. And that's what I'm contesting. I'm not contesting the significance of the 1949 revolution at all. I completely agree with that. What I want to discuss is what happened in the 1980s and 90s in terms of after the Cultural Revolution and the cooperative nature of peasant agriculture in China, right? Okay, so it wasn't a direct, no, I just want to add one or two more things about Lenin, which I think I'll be very quick on this, because in fact, it's very similar to what Brother Cecil was saying, right? I mean, I want to separate this position from the hypocrisy of Western social democracy, right? Because this was a penultimate thing that Lenin wrote. This is all very concentrated, very short articles in the last 2 years of his life, right? And this is kind of like, set this down, set down this. This is almost like his last word. This is actually his penultimate testament, right? And what he says is, what Western European democracy misses is we have to have a combination of the peasant war with working class insurrection. He points to the point which has already been made, which is in order to have what he says, civilization here, modernization, culture, modern society, we needed to make a revolution in order to bring that about, okay? And he also points to the East, which is credibly, given the failure of social democracy in Western Europe, the only way the revolution could go is from the East, and today we'd say the global South, right? And he points out that from the global East, India, China, rest of Asia, there'd be much greater diversity of conditions, right? So there's a continuity in Lenin's thought and what happened in China with the Communist Party and Mao's thought. I mean, there is a strong claim to a sort of Marxist-Leninist continuity. Before leaving Lenin, I want to make one other point, which is an earlier, very important book he wrote about the development of capitalism in Russia, right? And this is probably his first major work. And basically, he was arguing against two different positions, right? The Narodniks were populists, and they said there will be a Russian road to socialism. Capitalism cannot and will not develop in our country, right? The particularity of Russia is so strong that we will find our own way, right? And the legal Marxists said, no, you're wrong. There is capitalism in Russia, and that's a good thing, basically. And we'll have to wait for the conditions to mature before we can go on to socialism. Lenin's position was different to both of these, right? He actually said there is capitalism in Russia, but it's full of contradictions, and the workers and the peasants should fight to overcome those contradictions, right? And the crux of his argument, and this is the point I want to register and take forward, the crux of his argument was to show that capitalism was developing in Russia was commodity production had not only spread to the countryside, which it had, but labor itself would become a commodity. In other words, that there was a labor market functioning as the key underpinning of the Russian economy. This is really important. And the labor market in Russia at the time was fed by the peasantry being forced from the countryside and becoming a reserve arm of labor for industrial capital in the cities, right? This was the reality, right? So one other thing I want to take from earlier, so the last thing, right? The new economic policy also included not only a market economy for produce from the countryside, it also was a retreat in terms of foreign capital. And what they did is they allowed certain parts of the economy to be opened up to foreign capital. Very specific, very controlled. And that certain part of the economy was basically where they had resources that Western capitalists want, and that was the oil for Baku, right? So if you read Adam Hanier's book, which is a very good book on the history of capitalism and oil, you'll see that the early Soviet Union was actually a model for how a non-corrupt and progressive, if you like, government was forced to make a concession to Western capitalism, yet still fought to keep sovereignty and political control. And it's very interesting what he has to say about that. So that's Baku in the early 1920s. In the communist tradition, I want to make one other point, which is a legacy from Lenin and the early decade of the Communist International, which is the concept of labor superexploitation. This concept, as my researchers sort of rediscovered, to be honest, was first articulated in 1928, when African American brothers and sisters who were sympathetic to the October Revolution visited the Soviet Union and asked the Comintern cadre, basically, well, what about us? What does your Marxism have to say about us, right? And they worked together in teams to develop the concept of labor superexploitation, where African workers are more oppressed, and that oppression is registered in lower wages, worse conditions, more exhausting types of work, so on and so forth. They are more exploited within the capitalist system than white workers. This is not to deny the exploitation of white workers, it's to say that Black African descendant workers are even more oppressed. And this is in the circumstance of the United States. And I think that this is an extremely important conceptual development and strategic development, which I'll come on to. Right? And again, as Brother Cecil commented, Claudia Jones actually took this, and a whole team again of sister comrades from the Black movement in the United States, and subsequently here took this further forward again, okay, to include the specificity of African American women workers. There are two other developments of this concept which are important, right? The first comes in the generation of 1968 and the 70s, and there are different authors who contributed to this, but the clearest, most systematic is that work of Rumaru Marini, who is a Brazilian, who asked the question of what about the Latin American working class? And his position is very well informed, both about conditions in Latin America and about the whole sort of heritage of Marxist Capital, right? And what he basically did is he looked at each of the 3 volumes of Capital, how does that apply to Latin America? And in each case, he proposed extensions, critical developments of it, right? So there's a different aspect of surplus value involved in labor superexploitation. It affects how the whole economy is structured between producing means of production, means of consumption. Again, referring back to what Cecil's saying, the normal condition of neo-colonized countries is you export raw materials and foodstuffs and you import machinery and luxury goods, right? And there's a massive difference in terms of trade between the two. And Marini develops this along with others. Okay, and finally, the whole concept of an equal exchange. An equal exchange is really significant and central to understand how China fits in the world economy today, okay? It's a form that labor superexploitation takes as an imperialist division of labor, okay? With workers of the global south now majoring in manufacturing production for the sole reason that their lives are shorter, they work harder, they're less remunerated. They are superexploited as compared to the Western or the Northern working class. And this is reflected in cheaper commodities, right? Now, finally, this theoretical development from the Communist International, from African American comrades, from comrades from Latin America, clearly also applies on a world scale to the world system of imperialism, where global manufacturing has moved decisively to China and the global south. The fundamental reason is labor superexploitation. So what we have is labor superexploitation is a fundamental explanation of imperialism today. And this, I think, is the core of how China has fitted in to the world capitalist system. China in periods, again, confirming and agreeing with what Cecil already told us. And again, actually, the narrative of Chinese Communist Party I completely agree with about this, okay, which is the national humiliation of China by the Western powers from the Opium Wars on, okay, and the significance of the 1949 revolution. This interesting point, I want to sort of, I don't want to be too sort of academic about this, right? The communist revolution in China was a national democratic revolution, right? It was to get rid of the intervention of foreign powers, Japan, Britain, first Japan, and all the others as well, right? But what quickly followed on from it was more than a national democratic revolution. It was the collectivization of agriculture. It was a real social gain for the peasantry and for the working class, right? And because of this, China, communist China, was outlawed by the West. It was outside the circuit of Western imperialism, right? Now we know a long and checkered history, which I'm not going to go into, but the outcome of this was that there was a socialist social contract, okay, which is that the state did, and the Communist Party did share responsibility for the welfare of the people. I mean, it was real, okay? People were poor, but, you know, there was a concern about raising living standards, about collective methods of working together and so on. Now, in my view, after Mao's death, the capitalist roaders won the fight within the Chinese Communist Party through the language of modernization and opening. But what in fact happened in the first phase was the collectivity of agriculture was broken, and what had been collected became individualized, right? And there was also an increasing and sort of a cumulative privatization program and a more general opening to foreign investment. Now, all of this culminated in a big success story in terms of using these methods to modernize the economy, okay? And in the 1990s, certainly up to about 2008, 2010, it's like the growth of industrial manufacturing in China became the powerhouse for the whole world economy. By 2008, more than half the world's working class are in China. Okay? It is the center of industrial capitalism in the world, right? And in this period, it looks like both the Chinese state, if you like, and the establishment, I'll put it like this in China for now, were gaining from this, but also was the United States. So both ships were rising on this huge increase. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people being drawn in to the world capitalist system under conditions of labor super exploitation, 12-hour working, relatively low pay, working in barracks, so on and so forth. That's what made cheap goods available all around the world now, right? And then there comes a turning point. And actually, Hillary Clinton, by interesting coincidence, was also part of this turning point. Around about 2009, 2010, after the crisis of 2008, the US establishment flips its position on China, right? It's no longer, because in year 2000, the US was very keen to get China into the World Trade Organization. It had embraced its involvement in the world system, right? By 2008, 2009, Obama started the US pivot to Asia, right? Clinton and Obama, actually, right? And what this was the beginning of a militarized imperialist aggression towards China, right? 2000 and US military pressure escalates from here on in, right? And of course, the leadership, the Communist Party leadership in China have to take countermeasures to this, and they start to do so more programmatically, and in particular, Belt and Road Initiative and so on, which I think you can read in two ways. I mean, it's interesting which we want to give emphasis to. One way is to feed the industrial capitalism in China, its supply lines, where you're going to get the raw materials from, right? But the second way is as a counter strategy to US aggression, because the US aggression was already on by this time, right? Full on. And I mean, the book chapter I wrote was much more about the logic of US military aggression. And it basically stems from the Brzezinski doctrine, which basically said, when the Soviet Union falls, which it expected to do, or it has done, we have to control all the lands around the rim of the former Soviet Union. And notice Ukraine figures big in this world strategic scenario, right? And the reason they say this is because the United States, in order to become the dominant world power, has to have a base in Eurasia. We can't just be in the Americas. We have to have a base in Eurasia, right? Now, this logic gets extended to include China, basically. And so the Brzezinski doctrine shifts the focus south to the Indian Ocean. And what you have with Obama and Clinton and the pivot to Asia is a whole concentration on naval militarization, right? In particular, how does China get its oil? How does Japan get its oil? Where can we control the choke points? All of this is important, by the way, in terms of the genocide against the Tamils, because the genocide of the Tamils took place in Sri Lanka at the very apex of this sort of competition from the United States to make sure it controlled the Indian Ocean region militarily, right? And anything that got in its way, it will destroy. And that's the reason why it backed the genocide of 70,000 Tamils in 2009, basically. And there was no, at an international level, there was no opposition to this. Unlike what's happening in Palestine today, the massacre of the Tamils, there were none of the powers, Russia, China, and so on, not the United States, opposed this genocide at all. Okay, so it went ahead with without opposition, and they're still paying for it, right? So the West is more and more openly the aggressor in this, and you know, we heard now freedom of navigation, Taiwan, and so on, right? And China, very understandably, in my view, I don't dispute this whatsoever, has built its military to defend itself against this aggression, right? Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't you? Okay. So there's this interaction increasing. I'm just going to do this quite quickly because all of this deserves fuller attention. Well, I'm not going to be able to have time to give it, right? But the whole question of China and US in terms of economic relations is quite complex and sort of multi-threaded complexity, right? The underpinning thing has been this incredible rise of Chinese manufacturers as exports into the world system. But if you see this graph carefully, you'll see that it peaked. This peak is about 2015, right? A slight upturn, right? And, you know, what's happened is China's become in, so when?
We don't see the cursor.
Oh, the red one. You don't see the curve?
Yeah, I just thought you assumed that you know where your cursor is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah, the red one is China. Thank you. And then it sort of peaks here. And then it's trying to recover again in terms of how many exports. But this is the effect of the US and others sort of beginning to fight back and not welcoming Chinese cheap imports anymore, right? So in the period, right, of the boom, Chinese and US capital, in my view, in slightly different ways, admittedly, both benefited from the labor superexploitation, right? But if you take the big US corporations, a huge profit margins, Apple, etc. Another benefit is cheap imports. I mean, I bought a pair of gloves last winter from Sainsbury's, £5, okay, made in China. Last week we bought, you look at most household goods, you'll find most of them made in China, right? We bought a little step so we could step up and do the curtains or something like last week, made in China, right? 20 quid made in China. Okay, it's just become normalized, accepted, right? The degree to which basic manufacturing is made in China by workers in China, generally speaking, on very low wages, right? Now, the US profiting from foreign investment in China is not only by cheap imports. Sean Starr's very interesting reports about how much companies also benefited from the very growing internal market in China, right? And finally, another benefit for the US in particular has been China's sort of surplus capital accumulated, money capital invested in its treasury bonds in the United States, which keeps the dollar high and so on, right? So all of these things are things that in actual fact, there's no doubt the US has benefited from the involvement of China in world production chains, right? But of course, there are increasingly rivalries and contradictions, right? The US is trying to block now Chinese foreign investment into the United States. There is a competition for particularly the rare earths, so-called, and lithium and so on. US is very worried about China's got so much access, it's so far ahead, really, basically, of the United States in certain critical minerals, right? And of course, it's very well known. I'm just not going to detail it here, right? The competition in terms of the high tech. And the high tech competition is really, really crucial, right? In terms of who's got the stronger military capacity, right? Okay. So China developed an alternative strategy, particularly under Xi, and you can see here, it's very well known, these sort of very schematic, I know, right? Broad brush approaches. There are big questions about, again, Cecil sort of referred to this, what about the way China works in Africa? How does that relate? Or in the Middle East, where there are huge investments now of Chinese companies in the Gulf region, because they want to secure the oil, which, again, very understandable, right? So what we've got now is a connection between the internal and the external. There's a theorist who spoke again at SOAS just 2 weeks ago. Her name is Punungai, and she brought out a load of articles in a book about infrastructure capitalism. And she emphasizes that in China itself, high-speed rail is a crucial pillar of the economy, right? Because all the cities are connected, so much rapid transit and rapid growth. And so she calls this infrastructure capitalism. That's the name she gives it. And I mean, I'm just questioning, there's a lot of emphasis also from, in terms of how China has been very infrastructure oriented in its aid and investment in other global South countries, building an infrastructure. So I asked comrades in Latin America, so what do you think about China and Latin America? And this is not comprehensive, but this is real. I trust this friend, right? What he has to say. And what he says is China has moved in the first big boom, Western companies, including particularly British mining companies, benefited enormously from the demand for raw materials from China. They made a killing on supplying China from Latin America. Right? Much more now, Chinese companies are moving in for those supply chains, right? And he's saying the way they do projects is different to the way the Western companies do the projects, right? They're more holistic. There is more focus on infrastructure, right? There's also more public investment. And he points to the logic of the situation, which is understood, which is to guarantee supply chains. This is why it's happening. But he also says this mining activity is just as bad as Western mining activity is. And he also says, and I'm not sure if I go this far, he even says in this paragraph it's worse, right? Because deals are made between the local government and the Chinese companies, which enforce extremely harsh conditions to realizing the contracts, right? I'm not sure that's true, actually. And I mean, full discussion, right? Okay. And he gives an example from Peru, in actual fact, or in Ecuador, sorry. Big investments from China in Peru as well as Ecuador in the Andean region. Okay. I'm coming to my last 3 slides, kind of like bringing my comments to a conclusion. Okay. So the Communist Party's position is to counter US imperialism. It's been expanding its extractivism, right? And I think in so doing, it's defending China, but I don't think it's always defending others, right? And so I'm not sure if you can really, how far we go with a purely multipolar approach, which is based on state alliances and not popular alliances, because major forces in the world today are those forces fighting things like mining extractivism. So the question is, in defending China, what are we defending, right? Certainly, we are defending its sovereignty against imperialist aggression, okay? But I don't think it should be, or are we defending the capitalist restoration which took place? And there is here then a difference between allies and friends, if I put it like that, right? And is the situation, even as more or less as we speak, moving on towards, I don't say China's imperialist, but I think it's a genuine concern of the peoples involved in this relation, right? The technology gap is going to be crucial. We know this. It's not like, this is not a particular insight, a load of commentators to make the same point. And as China is capable of moving up the commodity chain to producing higher technology means of production, right? This is a challenge from the United States is really, really, really sensitive to this, right? And China is either overtaking or close to overtaking in several sectors in that respect, right? So it's very complex. I came into this from in support of the Tamils, and I do support all of those peoples in the Asian region who want to see peace in the Asian region. So I think the question of demilitarization is very valid, right? I also think we should be defending China's state sovereignty. So the legacy of the national democratic aspect of 1949 is real, I think, right? And the Communist Party of China and its control of the state is itself a major legacy, because this is a state power which most third world or global south countries simply don't have, right? And I mean, again, I've consulted to some degree, not fully, not extensively, but friends who are closer to the situation than I say the Communist Party still has got a working class base, and it does respond to real pressure from its working class base, right? And it does take the environment seriously, far more seriously than, for example, Britain or the United States, right? So there are social gains of 1949 still exist. You think of what China would have been like, what India's like today, and certainly if you compare it to dismantling of the gains that's taken place in Russia, right? However, the market reforms of the 1980s onwards are far more embedded than just the tactical retreat of the NEP that Lenin was speaking about. They have been a strategic retreat. And if you know, there's debates about how to characterize China. Is it a socialism with, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics? I would think it's best seen as a variety of state capitalism today, right? The United States wants China to remain a cheap labor neo-colony, but China, its state and capital, challenges that subordinated position and seek to compete for technological leadership. And all these tensions are accelerating. So the question is China the center of a potential counter-hegemonic bloc? I think it's not a model, mostly because we're in very different starting points. But an arm's length ally is much closer to how I would see it. How does China defend itself except by becoming an imperialist power? Let me put it like that. And this is an echo of, is there another way of doing it, right? As a question, I mean, a real genuine question. I'm not trying to be propagandistic about this, right? And Deng himself raised this very question at a speech he made in the United Nations in 1974, right? Does defending China's sovereignty against aggression mean we give it a free pass in terms of its own imperialist tendencies, right? How do we defend exploited workers and communities in the supplying countries? How to support the working class and peasantry in China without undermining state sovereignty? Okay, that's me.
Thank you, Andy. My brain is trying to absorb some of the really interesting and important arguments that you were making there, and I know it's something that will stimulate us all to continue thinking constructively about this issue. I'd now like to welcome Keith Bennett, who's coming up to the microphone. And this is our last speaker, and after that, I hope you will have in mind the kind of questions you'd like to ask the speakers and any other comments that you want to make from the floor. But we'll hear Keith first.
Thank you. I'm terribly old-fashioned, last century, so I don't have slides or anything. So would somebody mind turning the lights back on so I can actually read my text? That would be brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. Right. So it's my privilege or my burden to follow two excellent speakers. I agree with a lot of what they've said. I don't agree with all of it, as will perhaps become obvious. But I do think that I would like to think that we end up in an agreement on what's actually important for us here in this country where we live and work and struggle, in that we see that imperialism is on a drive to war, and we have to mobilize and do whatever we can against that. And I think that's a fundamental point where, whatever else I might disagree with in some of what Andy had to say, I think there's no disagreements out there at all, and I think we should keep that in mind. I'd also think we should keep in mind that China is something like 23% of the world's population. So it is therefore, by definition, an incredibly complex place. And it's not, things in China are never a question of one thing or the other. When you're talking about, nearly a quarter of the world, between a fifth going towards a quarter of the world's population, and you're also talking about a country that, whether you're talking about the revolution that culminated in 1949 or the process that was unleashed with the beginning of what's called reform and opening up in 1978, on both counts, let alone the two of them together, but both singularly, I'd say that no country in human history has undergone such radical change in such a short period of time, and therefore it can't but be complex and contradictory and have more than one aspect. Or, as I sometimes put it more colloquially, whatever's true about China, you're likely to find that the exact opposite is also true. So I'd like to, I would like people to keep that in mind, both with regard to what the two previous speakers have said and what I intend to say myself. So that's my kind of preamble based on what I've heard this afternoon already. But I'd like very much to thank the Free Mumia of the Jamal Campaign UK for their initiative in organising this discussion on China and the international anti-imperialist struggle, and for inviting me to speak. Now, we'll partially address this already, but some might ask why a campaign such as yours might wish to address such a topic. But such a view could be said to not fully take account of why you have, correctly in my view, placed such importance on Mumia's case and on the necessity to win the freedom of this revolutionary fighter, who has endured some 43 years of incarceration in the hellhole conditions of the US prison system without losing his revolutionary faith and will or his original aspiration. Now, whether before or throughout his long imprisonment, Mumia's writings have expressed unwavering solidarity with the struggles of peoples throughout the world against imperialism. In his early teens, he joined the Black Panther Party. Many things distinguish the Panthers, of course, from armed self-defense to free breakfast programs for children, to clinics to treat sickle cell anemia. But equally distinctive was the strong solidarity the party expressed and the inspiration it drew from the Asian socialist countries, from China, Vietnam, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. From their long-standing, protracted struggles against imperialism, and from their revolutionary standpoint and their creative application and development of Marxism-Leninism from the standpoint of the oppressed. In turn, these countries strongly supported the struggle of the Black Panther Party and highly valued the presence of such an ally engaged in a common struggle from within the belly of the beast. During the Panthers' heyday, almost every issue of the party's newspaper carried articles in support of the struggle of the Chinese people and those of other revolutionary socialist countries, Vietnam, the DPRK, Cuba, and Albania. In his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, Huey P. Newton, writing of his 1971 visit to the People's Republic of China, described it as the first time in his life that he felt truly free. Kathleen Cleaver chose to give birth in the DPRK capital, Pyongyang, and gave her child a Korean name. Mumia's Wikipedia entry notes, and I quote, Abu Jamal has described being kicked into the Black Panther Party as a teenager of 14 after suffering a beating from white racists and a policeman for trying to disrupt a 1968 rally for independent presidential candidate George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, who was running on a racist platform. From then, he helped form the Philadelphia branch of the Black Panther Party with Defense Captain Reggie Schell and other Panthers. He was appointed as the chapter's Lieutenant of Information, responsible for writing information and news communications. In an interview in the early years, Abu Jamal quoted Mao Zedong saying, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." That same year, he dropped out of Benjamin Franklin High School and began living at the branch's headquarters. And now all this is what I believe makes today's discussion so fitting and appropriate. To speak about China and the global struggle against imperialism today, as I've committed to try to do, is to approach a topic that has various aspects and component parts. Basically, there is China's role, and there is the nature, character, and stage of the struggle against imperialism today. These are by no means unchanging and immutable. If anything, the opposite is the case. As far back as 1847, in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels referred to the various stages of development through which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through. So, whilst the various aspects of our topic are distinct, they are also deeply and profoundly interconnected. They not only impact and influence one another, each changes the other and in turn is changed by the other in a constant process. Whilst this might be held to be the case with all interconnected phenomena, it can be said to apply with particular cogency in this case, one in which China is playing an ever greater role in international affairs and steadily advancing to the centre of the world stage. You can find reflections of this every day in the media, whether it be the relatively serious publications like the Financial Times or The Economist, or their more comic competitors such as the Telegraph or the Mail. But in however partial, malign or distorted way, this reflects the rise of China, or what the Chinese communists referred to as the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. To take just a few random examples, there could be countless others. China is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It is the global leader in the fight against climate catastrophe on both the diplomatic and economic fronts. It is now the world's 2nd largest economy, or the largest if viewed in terms of purchasing power parity. It is the major trading partner of the overwhelming majority of the world's nations, and as Andy has noted, the world's factory in terms of production. Its universities graduate millions of students in STEM subjects every year. The largest number of the world's peer-reviewed academic papers annually are produced by Chinese scholars. It is the first country to land a space vehicle and explore the dark side of the moon. The entire country was covered in by far the world's largest network of high-speed rail in a matter of just a few years. And as the dramatic emergence of DeepSeek showed earlier this year, China is also a global leader in the emerging field of AI. China is also at the heart of a series of new emerging structures that are reconfiguring the international landscape to reflect the growing weight of the global south, the majority of hitherto downtrodden and oppressed humanity. Foremost among these are the BRICS Plus mechanism and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, along with a range of other bodies, such as the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the China CELAC Forum, CELAC being the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which was formed on the initiative of Hugo Chavez. Together, these represent the majority of both the world's population and of its GDP. It is this interlocking and overlapping emerging structure of alliances, networks, and institutions that, with all its contradictions, ambiguities, and shortcomings, is nevertheless creating the building blocks and stepping stones towards a reformed international order based on the global majority, rather than on the hegemonic diktat of a handful of, with one exception, white imperial powers. That is, to finally reversing the inequitable division of the world identified by Lenin as that between a handful of oppressor nations on the one hand and a great mass of oppressed nations on the other. All this was on vivid display in China at the end of August and the beginning of September, when the now 27-member SCO family gathered in Tianjin for the largest ever gathering in their quarter-century history, followed immediately by the leaders of China, Russia, and the DPRK, being joined by the heads of state and government from 24 other members of the Global South, as they took center stage at the Beijing commemoration of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War, as the Chinese call World War II. A commemoration that showed that whilst China seeks peace, not war, if war should be forced upon it, the country is increasingly prepared not simply to fight, but to win. Most fundamentally, all this and more rests on what is arguably the greatest, most profound, most thoroughgoing revolution in human history. It seems to me somewhat ironic that sections of the left, and even the communist movement in the West, should seek to credit the greatest ever contributions to human well-being, development, and happiness to capitalism rather than socialism. In contrast, in his last published article, Better, Fewer but Better, Lenin wrote, "In the last analysis, the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, China, India, etc. account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. And during the past few years, it is this majority that has been drawn into the struggle for emancipation with extraordinary rapidity, so that in this respect, there cannot be the slightest doubt what the final outcome of the world struggle will be. In this sense, the complete victory of socialism is fully and absolutely assured." The Chinese Revolution that led to the founding of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, 76 years ago this month, indeed changed the global balance of power. It created a socialist camp that stretched from Berlin to Shanghai. The victorious Chinese Revolution played a major role in checking and reversing US imperialism's advance in Asia, first in Korea and then in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It inspired and supported national liberation movements, many of them socialist-oriented, throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The 1955 Africa-Asia Conference, held in the Indonesian city of Bandung, adopted the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that China's Premier Zhou Enlai had first articulated in 1953, and then advanced jointly with the leaders of India and Myanmar, or Burma, the following year. Today's geopolitical initiatives, spearheaded by China, including the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and most recently to the Global Governance Initiative, are to a great extent the logical continuation and development of the Bandung spirit. Of course, there are some good comrades today who say that the spirit of Bandung is dead, that Bandung was political, but the BRICS are merely economic and have yet to rise to the position of being political, and so on. Now, this school of thought strikes me as somewhat odd. First, it is generally accepted in the Marxist movement that politics is the most concentrated expression of economics, as Lenin put it, for example, in his 1920 speech, "The Trade Unions, the Present Situation, and Trotsky's Mistakes." So the alleged dichotomy seems a somewhat false one. Are not the present tariff wars and chip wars economic in form, but entirely political in essence? Secondly, Bandung occurred at the height of the anti-colonial revolution. The very purpose of that revolution was to enable and empower countries and peoples to embark on the road of building a new society, developing their independent national economies, and improving their people's livelihood. Now that colonialism in its classic form has very largely, if not entirely, as the genocide in Gaza so graphically highlights, been extirpated from the face of the earth, it should scarcely be surprising that the focus of attention should turn increasingly to economic matters. The idea of a revolutionary Bandung, but a reformist at best, sub-imperialist at worst BRICS, is further belied by looking at who actually gathered in the Indonesian city. Yes, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam was there, but so was the puppet regime in Saigon. So were the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Shah's Iran. Even Japan was there. Today, no gathering specifically of the Global South would set a place at the table for Japan. In his November the 10th, 1963 message to the grassroots, Malcolm X summed up Bandung as follows. In Bandung was the first unity meeting in centuries of Black people. And once you study what happened at the Bandung Conference and the results of the Bandung Conference, it actually serves as a model for the same procedure you and I can use to get our problems solved. At Bandung, all the nations came together, the dark nations from Africa and Asia. Some of them were Buddhists, some of them were Muslims, some of them were Christians, some were Confucianists, some were atheists. Despite their religious differences, they came together. Some were communists, some were socialists, some were capitalists. Despite their economic and political differences, they came together. There seems to me no reason to suppose that Malcolm would not describe today's BRICS and other Global South initiatives pioneered by China in similarly forthright, succinct, and pithy terms, were he in a position to do so. It is not for nothing that the most prestigious leaders of the contemporary global struggle against imperialism and for socialism are near unanimous in their positive evaluation of the role played by China. To take just a very few examples, Fidel Castro said, "But if you want to talk about socialism, you must not forget what socialism has done in China. Once it was a country of hunger, poverty, disasters. Today, there is none of that. Today, China feeds, clothes, cares for, and educates 1.2 billion people. I think China is a socialist country and Vietnam is a socialist country as well. And they insist that they've introduced all the necessary reforms precisely to stimulate development and to continue advancing towards the objectives of socialism." He further said that China has objectively become the most promising hope and the best example for all third world countries. Speaking of the Chinese leader, he said, "Xi Jinping is one of the strongest and most capable revolutionary leaders I have met in my life." Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega has said, "The People's Republic of China has brought progress, benefits, development to peoples who were colonized and later became independent, but who were then subjugated under the boot of the interests of the powers that had colonized them, leaving those peoples in poverty, with people in misery, people going hungry, people in illiteracy, with infant mortality in Africa, in Asia. And the People's Republic of China has been developing a policy bringing benefits to developing countries without setting any conditions. The powers that have been colonialists and neo-colonialists, like the US, like Europe, have not stopped being colonialists. They are still neo-colonialists. They have not stopped being criminals. They still are criminals. They still are killers." Venezuela's Hugo Chavez regarded alliance with China as a bulwark against imperialism, a great wall against American hegemonism. China is large, but it's not an empire. China doesn't trample on anyone. It hasn't invaded anyone. It doesn't go around dropping bombs on anyone. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, has said that between China and Venezuela, there is a model relationship, a model of what should be the relationship between a superpower like China, the great superpower of the 21st century, and an emerging, heroic, revolutionary and socialist country like Venezuela. China has inaugurated a new era of the emergence of non-colonialist, non-imperialist, non-hegemonic superpowers. In summary, China's role, actions, policies and stands, and simply its objective reality and weight, certainly exercise influence and impact on the international situation and the global reality, and hence inevitably on the anti-imperialist struggle. But at the same time, all this is in turn impacted and conditioned by the actually existing objective situation. Yes, China is certainly changing the world, but China did not create the world which presently exists and in which it has to operate. That said, China is of course not a passive observer. Rather, the way in which it operates in the world is profoundly influenced, indeed characterized by, the nature of its ongoing long revolution and the theory, practice, strategy, and tactics developed in this course. These in turn have been moulded by the creative and dynamic interaction, integration, and cross-fertilization of China's reality, along with its millennia of history, culture, science, and civilization on the one hand, and the communist movements evolving and developing theory and practice, especially with regard to the anti-imperialist struggle and the revolution in the oppressed nations, including in a large semi-colonial, semi-feudal country, as was pre-liberation China on the other. The first great development in the long march of Marxism, the science of human liberation, to the east and south from its birthplace in the heart of the emergence of modern capitalism, comes with Marx and Engels' developing views on the significance of Ireland and the Irish question. In 1869, Marx made the profoundly brilliant observation, which could today be extrapolated to characterize the world struggle between global North and global South as a whole, that for a long time, I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything until it has got rid of Ireland. In his article, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, Lenin refers to this statement of Marx and adds, "It is impossible to estimate beforehand all the possible relations between the bourgeois liberation movements of the oppressed nations and the proletarian emancipation movement of the oppressor nation. The bourgeois liberation movement in Ireland grew stronger and assumed revolutionary forms." Writing on the significance of Dublin's 1916 Easter Rising in the discussion on self-determination summed up, Lenin defended the Irish revolutionaries against their socialist critics in terms that carry direct meaning for China's global strategy and tactics today. So one army lines up in one place and says, "We are for socialism," and another elsewhere and says, "We are for imperialism," and that would be a social revolution. Describing this as a ridiculously pedantic view, Lenin continues, "Whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is." Just as Lenin had observed that it was impossible to estimate beforehand all the possible relations between bourgeois liberation movements of the oppressed nations and the proletarian emancipation movement, it was in keeping with this materialist standpoint that it took the Great October Revolution, the 10 days that shook the world, to begin the work of establishing the correct relationship between the socialist forces and the struggle against imperialism in an all-round, comprehensive and scientific way. In his draft theses on the national and colonial question, prepared for the Second Congress of the Communist International, the Comintern in 1920, Lenin insisted that all communist parties must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement in these, namely the oppressed, countries. The previous year, in his address for the Second All-Russia Congress of Communist Organizations of the Peoples of the East, Lenin had explained, "The socialist revolution will not be solely or chiefly a struggle of the revolutionary proletarians in each country against their bourgeoisie. No, it will be a struggle of all the imperialist oppressed colonies and countries, of all dependent countries against international imperialism." The theses on the Eastern question, adopted by the Comintern's Fourth Congress in December 1922, explained, "The refusal of communists to take part in the fight against imperialist tyranny on the pretext of their supposed defense of independent class interests is the worst kind of opportunism and can only discredit the proletarian revolution in the East." As Stalin explained in his 1924 work, Foundations of Leninism, in words that stand in direct refutation of any number of contemporary leftist attacks on China's policies of uniting with the broadest possible range of forces in the global South, the revolutionary character of a national movement under the conditions of imperialist oppression does not necessarily presuppose the existence of proletarian elements in the movement, the existence of a revolutionary or republican program of the movement, the existence of a democratic basis of the movement, The struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. For the same reasons, the struggle that the Egyptian merchants and bourgeois intellectuals are waging for the independence of Egypt is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the bourgeois origin and bourgeois title of the leaders of the Egyptian national movement, despite the fact that they are opposed to socialism. It was this leap in revolutionary theory, occasioned by the leap in revolutionary practice manifested in the founding of the world's first workers' state, that led directly to the founding of the communist movement in China. As Mao Zedong put it, the salvos of the October Revolution brought us Marxism-Leninism. The October Revolution helped progressives in China, as throughout the world, to adopt the proletarian world outlook as the instrument for studying a nation's destiny and considering anew their own problems. The October Revolution also changed the world outlook of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of China's bourgeois democratic revolution, who revised his three people's principles to embrace cooperation with the Communist Party, alliance with Soviet Russia, and support for the workers and peasants, thereby creating the conditions for the formation in 1924 of the first united front between the Communist Party and the nationalist Kuomintang, until the murderous betrayal in 1927 by Chiang Kai-shek, Dr. Sun's successor, following his untimely death. In one of his poems, Mao Zedong wrote, "Bitter sacrifice strengthens bold resolve, which dares to make sun and moon shine in new skies." From the brutal decimation of the young Communist Party of China in the terrible massacres in Shanghai and elsewhere, Mao Zedong went on to advance perhaps his single greatest contribution to Marxism, namely his thesis that in a country such as China, while the working class remained the leading force of the revolution, the peasantry would constitute the main force, and on this basis, it was possible to build stable revolutionary base areas, wage a protracted people's war, surround the cities from the countryside, and ultimately seize nationwide political power by armed force. It was on the basis of the strong independent power and mass foundations thus created that the CPC was able to establish and sustain the Second United Front during the period of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, thereby helping to create a distinctly Chinese Marxism, first known as Mao Zedong thought. Mao further applied his understanding and practice of the United Front to matters of international policy, and not least to how to handle the relationship between the various imperialist powers. In his 1940 article on policy, he wrote, "The Communist Party opposes all imperialism, but we make a distinction between Japanese imperialism, which is now committing aggression against China, and the imperialist powers which are not doing so now, between German and Italian imperialism, which are allies of Japan and have recognized Manchukuo, and British and US imperialism, which are opposed to Japan, and between the Britain and the United States of yesterday, which followed a Munich policy in the Far East and undermined China's resistance to Japan, and the Britain and the United States of today, which have abandoned this policy and are now in favor of China's resistance. Our tactics are guided by one and the same principle: to make use of contradictions, win over the enemy, oppose the few, and crush our enemies one by one." Mao was to consistently apply this framework to his understanding of international affairs. A typical example of his theory of the intermediate zone may be found in his August 1964 interview with Japanese socialists. He said, "The United States rules over Europe, it rules over Canada, it rules over Latin America except for Cuba. Its hands reach all the way to Africa. All the nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America are rising against imperialism. Even Europe, Canada, and other countries are rising against imperialism. Imperialists are even rising against imperialists. Isn't this what de Gaulle is doing? At the present time, there exist two intermediate zones in the world. Asia, Africa, and Latin America constitute the first intermediate zone. Europe, Northern America, and Oceania constitute the second. Japanese monopoly capital belongs to the second intermediate zone, but even it is discontented with the United States, and some of its representatives are openly rising against the United States. Though Japanese monopoly capital now is dependent on the United States, the time will come when it too will shake off the American yoke. And he applied the same methodological framework when he advanced his theory of the three worlds in the 1970s. And today, China proceeds from the same premise in building the broadest possible unity against US hegemonism, including wherever possible with the countries of Europe and others such as Australia and New Zealand, even though this path is strewn not with roses but with thorns, to quote an authoritative 1977 exposition of the theory of three worlds. Key to a proper understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of all this is Mao Zedong's work on contradiction, which constitutes his principal contribution to dialectics. In his 1937 work of that title, written in the heat of battle against Japan, he notes, "There are still 2 points in the problem of the particularity of contradiction which must be singled out for analysis, namely the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. There are many contradictions in the process of development of a complex thing, and one of them is necessarily the principal contradiction, whose existence and development determine or influence the existence and development of the other contradictions. Hence, if in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction, playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. Therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. Once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved." So from this, we can understand some of the theoretical conclusions that inform China's international practice. For example, the united front. Unite the many, defeat the few. Unite all who can be united against the main enemy. Distinguish between greater and lesser enemies, immediate and longer-term enemies. Distinguish between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, between contradictions between the people and the enemy, and the contradictions among the people. On this basis, we can understand how China's strategy of uniting the global south through BRICS, the SCO, and so on, embodies Mao's principle of surrounding the city from the countryside, extended, developed, and applied to the global geopolitical stage. In a sense, it is not dissimilar in its thinking to that of Lin Biao's 1965 article, Long Live the Victory of People's War, albeit that one reflects a period when wars of national liberation were raging across the tricontinent, and the other a context where the principal focus, at least so long as a major global war does not break out, has shifted to the struggle for economic independence and for development. The China scholar and anti-war campaigner Jenny Clegg has theorized this as an international new democracy. She explains, as China now directs its efforts towards encouraging an international anti-imperialist movement among states of the global south, with the BRICS as a significant group, the concept of new democracy can shed light on the thinking behind this. There are 3 key points to highlight: an understanding that world revolution develops through stages, an analysis of the national bourgeoisie which recognizes their potential to resist imperialist subordination and take part in independent development, and the assessment of the overall international situation given the existence of a major socialist state. Anti-imperialism and socialism are not the same, but they are interrelated. In the ebb and flow of the international situation, the BRICS may swing this way and that, but what does make a difference to the anti-imperialist struggle in its international dimension is the solidity of China's socialism. As a socialist country, China is the most firm in its anti-imperialist stance. It has the strength, unity, and maneuverability to stand up to and resist US pressure. It has its past experience to draw lessons from, failures as well as successes. It can stabilize the vacillations of the BRICS members to foster the group's collective focus. It has the commitment and the sense of direction for the future to open the way ahead for the wider global south in its struggle against imperialism. Through its own development, China is able to offer an enabling environment for other developing countries to remove those obstacles still constraining their national development. Now, of course, there are many objections to all of this. So when discussing developments such as the BRICS, it is important, I think, to be clear as to what they are and what they are not. We are not talking here about the stage of socialism, and it is necessary to draw. Yeah, you're going to tell me to shut up.
Tell you that we're coming to the end.
Okay, yeah,
That would be-
okay. Okay, it is important to be clear what they are and what they are not. We are not talking about the stage of socialism here, and it is necessary to draw clear lines of demarcation, both with those who misrepresent such bodies as socialist, and with those who denounce them on the grounds that they are not something that they have ever claimed to be, which is a classic example of what Zhou Enlai once described as one tendency covering another. We are talking here about processes and structures that are full of contradictions, that are often partial, tentative, fragile, and emerging. The position and role of India within both the SCO and BRICS is perhaps the clearest such example. The situation is, in fact, precisely as described by the Korean revolutionary leader Kim Il-sung in the article he wrote commemorating the first anniversary, the death of Che Guevara, in words that have lost none of their relevance and cogency after 57 years. Kim Il-sung wrote, "True, there may be various categories of people among those who oppose imperialism. Some may be active against imperialism, others may vacillate in the anti-imperialist struggle, and still others may join in the anti-imperialist struggle reluctantly under the pressure from their own people and the peoples of the world. But whatever their motives, it is necessary to enlist all these forces, except the henchmen of imperialism, in the anti-US struggle. If more forces, though inconsistent and unsteady, are drawn into the anti-US joint struggle to isolate US imperialism to the largest possible extent and deal blows to it by joint action, that will be a good thing and by no means a bad thing. Those who avoid the anti-imperialist struggle should be induced to turn out in the struggle against imperialism, and those who are passive encouraged to be active in the anti-imperialist struggle." This is the process in which today China objectively stands at the head. As Xi Jinping has said, socialism with Chinese characteristics offers a new option for those countries that wish to rapidly develop their economies while maintaining their independence. This is not just a matter of words, but of deeds. Some 150 countries have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, first proposed by China in 2013. Its focus on connectivity and infrastructure embodies the key prerequisites for modernization, while enabling developing countries to more readily trade and cooperate among themselves, rather than just seeing their raw materials flow to the global north. The more recent emphasis on small but beautiful projects ensures more immediate and tangible benefits for grassroots communities, and particularly women and marginalized groups. Just this August, China signed a $55 million agreement with Zimbabwe to promote socio-economic development, enhance food security, and support targeted projects intended to improve the livelihoods of vulnerable communities. So far, the BRI has directly created some 500,000 jobs and lifted some 40 million people out of poverty in what is developing into a generalization and internationalization of China's own development strategy, which has succeeded in completely eliminating absolute poverty for the first time ever in the country's long history. This is the real reason why the United States, the European Union, and the Western press, foolishly joined by some on the left, attacked and maligned the BRI with such malicious accusations as that of debt trap diplomacy. This is nothing but holding a mirror to their own face. Does anyone seriously believe that creatures like Marco Rubio or Ursula von der Leyen actually give a damn for the countries and peoples of the global south, and especially for their poor, indigenous and marginalized communities, when they warn, cajole and threaten with regard to the supposed dangers of engaging with the BRI? So, China's current international strategy is not a program for socialism, and it is certainly not an attempt to foist China's system on others. But by enhancing independence and promoting development, it does provide necessary and better conditions for countries and peoples to embark on the socialist road if they so choose. And if they do so choose, As examples such as Venezuela and Nicaragua highlight, they will have no stronger backup and friend than China. Thank you.